I call the following tactic a diversion, although the dictionary confuses it with a feint. A feint is a pretend attack, whereas a diversion is a real but unconventional attack coming from an outside source and is something your opponent must react to. A common diversion used in warfare is fire. Sun Tzu describes no fewer than 5 attacks using fire. For example, if an enemy army was lining up their troops to attack, then a fire started in their supply camp would force them to break off the attack and go put out the fire or starve. During a prison outbreak, many fires can be started so that the prison guards will be diverted to fighting the fires, and in the confusion, the prisoners can escape. Another way of creating a diversion is to trick a third party into attacking your enemy. If you need an example, there is no better than what is happening right now. Our pedophile psychopathic leaders have unleashed one of the greatest hoaxes in history, the current pandemic. It wasn't enough to have us battling left against right, black against white, men against women, heterosexual against whatever, but they threw in this giant fake threat that we all have to deal with, a massive diversion. And what is the pandemic diverting us from? It's diverting us from fighting back against the very real and obvious steps being taken to ensure our total slavery. Before I tell the story of how I used this strategy to rescue a woman who was being beaten, I want to digress for a moment and explain a little about strategy. In my 40 years of teaching martial arts, I have always sought to teach my students strategy and tactics. These are the key elements in any battle. Defeating someone in combat is not up to only who is stronger and faster, but who is more cunning. But I have not yet found an effective way to teach this. Like the following story, many of the strategies I have employed in life are not the result of a scholastic understanding of strategy, but the result of instinct. In the sparring ring, instinct tells you that your opponent's left jab is a feint for a right leg roundhouse kick to your ribs. Instinct moves you to weave around the jab, step in and jam the kick, grab the leg, and sweep your opponent's left leg out from under him. This cannot be thought out while it's happening. So I changed my approach. I would teach my students instinct. But again, this was something that is difficult to teach. What I think may help, and the reason for these talks, is that one way to teach strategy is through stories. I could give a 2-hour lecture on different strategies and how they work, but the next day, most people probably wouldn't remember much of it and still have little understanding of how to apply it. But if you could see how tactics worked, that would be a better way of learning them. A story puts you in the action, and you can see it being applied. You may forget my stories, but when faced with danger, your subconscious will likely remember my story more than my lecture, and guide your instinct to find the best strategy to employ. So, onto my story. The year was 1974, and I was 17. I had dropped out of high school, ran away from home, and with 2 buddies, we bought a 1963 Ford Fairlane with the intention of driving to Vancouver. We worked a couple of weeks at a time in sawmills to pay for gas and food along the way, sleeping in the tent at the local campground. We got as far as Calgary when the engine blew a piston rod. Well, that was that. We had no money for repairs, and so we sold the car for scrap for $100. One of my buddies, Sakuchi, phoned his parents and they wired him bus money to go back to Toronto. My other buddy, Cliff, was hired the next day to work on the railroad way up in Fort McMurray. Absurd and unbelievable as it may seem, in those days you could apply for a job, get hired, and start work first thing the next morning. That left me broke and homeless in Calgary. But after sleeping rough a couple of days and eating at the Sally Ann, I found day work by standing on a certain corner. There, guys that needed short-term labor would pull up and offer $100 if you would help them. Pretty good money for the time. Mostly I helped people move their damn deep freezer down 10 flights of stairs. A week later, I got a full-time job driving a 5-ton split-axle truck van. I moved in with 4 other guys into a low-rent apartment off 6th Avenue, and life was good again. One day, it was a Sunday, I went for a walk through the city. Back then in Canada, on Sundays, everything was closed. No convenience store, no pharmacy, nothing. Everything is closed, and the streets were empty. It was then that I heard the blood-curdling screams of a woman. As I walked down the street, I saw a large and powerfully built man holding a woman by the throat with one hand and slapping the living shit out of her with the other hand. Just to digress for a moment, at that time in my life I was reading a lot about King Arthur. I read every book on the subject and was fascinated by the Arthurian legend. Years later, I named my kung fu club Pendragon, the surname of King Arthur. I saw myself as a white knight, and a woman was in trouble. Can I continue down the street and just pretend I don't see anything? That's what most people would do today, but I could not. There was no one else around, and so I had to help. Now, any cop will tell you the most dangerous situation to find yourself in is in a domestic dispute. So what am I, a snot-nosed skinny teenager, going to do against this street-hardened criminal? I knew that if I were to go up to him and say, "Hey, get your hands off that woman," that I would be next to get a royal bitch slapping. There was no chance of phoning the police. This was long before cell phones, and the nearest phone booth was 4 blocks away. What I did was pure instinct. I never thought any of this out. To this day, I don't know what possessed me to do this. What I did was run towards the guy, full speed, and when I got to the scene, I said, "Hey, mister, a guy down the street just called the cops on you." The guy looked at me in shock. Then he looked behind me down the street. Then he looked at me again and said, "Thanks, little buddy." And with that, he ran off down the street. I asked the lady if she was all right and if there was anything I could do to help. She looked at me and asked, "There isn't any guy that phoned the cops, is there?" I said, "No, ma'am." She looked at me with tears in her eyes and simply said, "Thank you." This was the strategy of diversion. The criminal didn't have to deal with me. He was more worried about a third force arriving on the scene, even though that third force was just a ruse. I was a hero to the criminal and a hero to the battered woman, and walked away without a scratch. This is what I hope I can convey with these stories, that no matter how grim the situation, with a little street smarts, a little strategy, and a lot of bullshit, you can not only come through it, but come out smelling like a rose. To this day, I will not turn a blind eye to the suffering of people or wildlife. I think it is the duty of every man to stand up against violence and cruelty. If more of us did, we would not all be in the dire situation we are in now.